Good evening, and apologies for walking in a bit late. The traffic of Delhi is unpredictable, though my friend and colleague came from the same place and got here on time, so probably the fault is mine. And now that the ambassador of Mexico isn't here, I can probably assert a claim of certain connectedness to Mexico as well, but that's for other occasions. Why are we discussing this topic? I think we are because the world is currently passing through very difficult times. And really, precisely at a time when we've never been as interconnected as we are today. There are only a few mechanisms that exist for regulating global flows and networks, and those that exist aren't working very well. The traditional centers of global dynamism are either in a situation of stasis or worse, in a state of crisis. Multilateralism is largely dysfunctional, and multipolarity is yet a distinct prospect. The global distribution of power is getting more diffuse, certainly, but it is still mostly power without purpose. And there are a new set of states that are emerging, but they still lack decision-making mass. And it's by no means certain that these states that are emerging, these emerging powers, will use their increased power not only to further their own interests, but also to promote the common good. So that, it seems to me, in a way, summarizes where we are today. And if you were to now, in that context, look at the G20, it becomes quite clear. Some things do become very clear. First of all, the geographical distribution is extremely uneven. There's only one country from Africa, only one from the Middle East, 2 Eurasian countries, 2 from South America, 3 from North America, 4 European countries plus the EU, that's 5 of them, and 6 countries from the Asia Pacific. And lest you believe that the Asia Pacific is the best represented, do remember that there's only one continent which has 100% representation, and that's North America. In fact, in some ways, the best represented continent in the context of the G20 is North America. In terms of the developing kind of division, it breaks out almost evenly. You've got the G8 plus South Korea, Australia, and the European Union on sort of the developed column. And in the developing column, you have China, Indonesia, and India, Argentina and Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. Together, we know that the G20 account for 80% of global world output, gross world output, 80% of world trade. If you include intra-EU trade, less than 80%, about 78% of the world's population. So a pretty huge chunk in some ways, even though they're just 19 countries and an organization. Could these 19 countries and an organization, as they're currently configured, replace the UN? Well, obviously not. I mean, a universal organization can only be replaced by a universal organization, as my colleague Professor Murthy has just stated. But of course, that's not the question we are pondering about. We're not asking whether the G20 will replace the UN. We're asking whether it would be more effective than the UN. And I think out there the answer is really ought to be a very nuanced, that depends. On what? It depends both on the issue area that we are focusing on, as well as on what we mean by effective. So why don't we try to look then at some of those issue areas? It seems to me that contemporary global problems come in 3 very different types. And one of our problems in analytical terms is that we very unhelpfully conflate and confuse them. I think the first type of problems that we confront globally are new problems that are either being confronted by the world for the first time, anthropogenic climate change, for example, or they're being confronted for the first time in a globalized form, epidemics and pandemics, for example. So that's, in the case of this first set of problems, the solutions must necessarily require ingenuity, the ability to think out of the box, novel approaches. There's a second set of problems. These are old problems: world trade, urbanization, energy and resource scarcity. But these are a set of old problems that require new approaches and solutions, because quite clearly, patently, the old approaches no longer work. So here we can think about such things as a renewed emphasis on multilateralism, and there are other ways in which we could tackle these. But there's a third set of issues as well, as third type of problem. And these are, in some ways, old problems, old solutions, but new actors. And here we have a range of traditional security issues: the sea lanes of communication, WMD proliferation, terrorism. And all of these, this third type of problem, is being impacted by the ongoing, hegemonic decline, power transition, those sorts of issues. Now, how effective the G20 will be, both in absolute terms and relative to other global governance structures such as the UN, will depend, I feel very clearly, on what type of problem of global governance we are talking about. So it's very, very difficult to come up with, in that sense, anything like a yes-no answer to a question of this nature. And that, I think, shouldn't surprise us. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time, the remainder of the time I have left before the flow of flowers begins, to sort of look a little closely at this whole notion of sort of global governance. And I'm actually drawn back to one of the first great political scientists, that's Harold Lasswell, who way back in 1936 defined politics as being about who gets what, when, and how. And I think, sometimes you need to really get back to basics to sort of begin to get a handle on things. And I think if you sort of just look at this, who gets what, when, and how, then obviously the who question becomes the most important. Who governs? Who's excluded? Who benefits? At whose expense? But taken together, these four questions, I think, lie at the heart of the global governance problems of our times. And global governance itself is fascinating because it's actually arisen as an idea. It's a seminal idea for our times, but it has arisen really in a period of about 15 to 20 years. If you sort of try to do a search of the term global governance, you probably get your first hit about 17 years ago. Before that, it just didn't exist. And yet it has come to really become one of those dominating ideas in world politics today. And in its simplest form, it's about how power operates in an interdependent environment in the absence of government. So, if you don't have government and you have interdependence, how on earth does power politics operate? That, in some fundamental senses, is what global governance is about. And in some of my sort of the writings I'm doing now, sort of suggest that there are, in fact, 10 P's in global governance. And these P's are participation, presence, permanence, posts, problems, postures, positions, policies, programs, and power. And they're not, and each of them are, in fact, very different and raise very different types of issues. So participation, for instance, is about having a role in the taking of decisions that have an impact on one's present situation and future possibilities. Presence is about the right to be a part of decision-making institutions and structures. Permanence is a special form of presence, obviously. It's about the lack of any exit or sunset clause. Now, a lot of these issues of participation, presence, and permanence are not going to be ultimately decided or resolved in the G20. They are going to be resolved ultimately in the only forum that makes sense for these, which is the United Nations. What about the question of posts? The question of posts is about the possession of executive authority. It is about who occupies posts of significance in the institutions that deal with global issues, those institutions that have a global impact. Here, it is really, in some ways, a question about who implements programs, who executes decisions, and the widespread discontent about leadership of the Bretton Woods institutions, for example. Here, the issue is, for those who are not sort of up to date with it, most of this audience would be, the presidentship of the World Bank reserved for an American and the directorship of the IMF, in effect, for a European. Issues like that. I think the question of posts is one where the G20 is likely to, in fact, be a very, very effective forum to sort of work that issue out. Problems, as I've already suggested to you, ladies and gentlemen, are of three types as I see them, and they lie at the heart of sort of the global governance issues. We've got postures and positions. Both are a priori statements of interest, preferences, and negotiating stances. Postures are general, positions are specific. Postures represent an overall approach to a problem. Positions lay down the limits of what is not negotiable. Postures tend to be tacit and implicit. Positions are explicit, usually declared. It seems to me here we have a very interesting breakup. I think in the future we're probably going to see postures sort of emerging more in the United Nations, and positions, those more concrete, emerging in sort of fora like the G20. Policies and programs, it seems to me really here the G20 isn't in the picture at all. It's all about the United Nations, particularly in the context of its specialized agencies. And finally, the question of power. Well, that's of course the biggest issue. That's the alpha, that's the omega. It all starts there, it all ends there. And power is about how matters are decided, how they're implemented. It seems to me that when it comes to that core question of power, there I do think that this provocative sort of question does make sense, because in a very real way we can see how a lot of power politics is actually going to fructify in the G20 rather than in the United Nations. I'll end on one final thought before the white rose land descends upon me, and that is this. There is already a certain informed permanence with regards to the G20 itself. In other words, the G20 has taken a decision that it will, at least for some time to come, retain its current membership. And even though there are other candidates around, particularly some small economically powerful countries are being ignored. Norway, Singapore, Dubai, the UAE in that sense. So there are some very critical, small, well-performing economies that probably should be somewhere in the mix. But I don't think that that's going to happen given the current structure. Let me stop at this point.